Morning, all the participants here in place and in Malmö, but also those who participate digitally. A very warm welcome to this 6th Nordic Climate Forum for Construction that actually started here in Malmö for 6 years ago. It was the National Board of Housing, Building and Planning, Boverket. I will continue to use Boverket. And the Finnish Ministry of Environmental in Finland who started up this forum to have these networking meetings. So my name is Kristina Einarsson and I work at Boverket, who is this year's host of this Nordic Climate Forum for Construction. And I will be the moderator during this day. And we arranged this forum together with the other Nordic authorities and Estonia, and also with the Nordic Sustainable Construction Program. So this is being prepared together with all these. And I just want to start with this and highlight what is the aim and target with this forum. Some of you have been perhaps participating previously, but some of you are perhaps new in this. And the aim with this forum is to promote Nordic harmonization when it comes to regulation about climate impact for buildings. There's a lot happening. For 6 years ago, there were no regulation in none of the Nordic countries, no upcoming EU regulation in this area. And now you know that there are 3 countries in the Nordic that have regulation in place. The others are working with their regulation, and we have also EU regulation on its way. So to get an update on this, where are we now? What is decided? What is upcoming? That's also the purpose, to give you that update, both on Nordic regulation but also on upcoming EU regulation. But I also want to highlight that we want to meet you physically. We have all of you, different Nordic countries, have dialogues with the industry and scientists. But now we want to collect you all here and have this type of discussion together with you, and to get comments on this, the regulation that we are working on. We at the authorities, we're not the expert in this area. It is you who are in the construction sector, and also you who are LCA expert who has this knowledge that we need. And the target is to facilitate for the construction industry, to reduce climate impact. We introduce this type of regulation to keep this, to steer to reduce climate impact. But it is quite administrative. This is an administrative regulation. So we don't want to have excessive administrative burdens for you. And that is to promote innovation and development. So what is the necessary regulation in this area? And also we want to give input from the Nordics to give input to this upcoming EU regulation. So that is the aim and target with this forum. And today's program is that we have presentations in the morning, and that is to give you all a platform. Where are we now? What is the knowledge base? And then to have these roundtable discussions in the afternoon. So we really want to spend a lot of time to get input from you on this topic. So we will start with a greeting from the Swedish Minister, Andreas Carlsson. It will be a video recording, and it's fresh and recorded for this occasion. And then we have 2 representatives for this EU Outlook. Philip Mosley and Lucy Rook are going to give a presentation and update. And then you get also a Nordic Outlook mapping on what is the status in the Nordic. And then we'll have a coffee break, and then we will go a little bit deeper and try to see what kind of experience do we have in those countries that have regulation in place, meaning Denmark, Norway and Sweden. And then from then on, we want to hear the industry's experience from the regulation in these countries. They haven't been in place for such a long time, but still, can we see some kind of experiences, and what is your input to our continuous work with this regulation? So a focus is regulation, really. And then you will also get an update on the other countries in the Nordics working with their regulation. And then we will have a lunch break. So I hope this will be fruitful, and some practical information for those of you who are here. You have the toilets just outside here, behind the lobby. And in case of emergency, you need to go out the main stairs, and the collection is, in case of fire, is outside here on the quay. And you find also stairs on both sides of the lobby. So I hope we don't need to use them today. So With that said, I want to start this year's forum with greetings from the Swedish government, Andreas Carlsson, who is Minister of Infrastructure and Housing in Sweden, and it is a video recording.
I would like to welcome you all to this year's Nordic Climate Forum for Construction in Malmö. The Nordic Prime Ministers have agreed on the goal that the Nordic region will strive to become the most sustainable and integrated region in the world by 2030. A sustainable and competitive Nordic construction sector plays a significant role in reaching this vision. Last year, the Nordic Ministers for Housing and Construction agreed on a declaration for low-carbon construction and circular principles in the construction sector. The ministers agreed to continue Nordic collaboration on lowering the climate impact from buildings and harmonizing relevant regulations, methods, and data. I recently hosted a meeting with the Nordic Ministers for Housing and Construction in Gothenburg. We got an insight in the valuable results from the ongoing Nordic collaboration in the area and discussed continued Nordic collaboration to further develop a sustainable and competitive Nordic construction sector. Nordic countries are in the forefront on solutions and measures to reduce the climate impact from buildings, such as energy efficiency, climate impact assessments, and circular principles. By generating and sharing knowledge, we find new and innovative Nordic solutions. And the Nordic Climate Forum for Construction is a valuable platform for this collaboration. The green transition goes hand in hand with competitiveness and growth. Business and industry are leading the way in reducing emissions. The recently updated roadmap for fossil-free competitiveness in the Swedish construction sector shows that the industry is making good progress and that further commitments are being made by actors throughout the whole value chain. The government's climate action plans includes measures to facilitate more sustainable construction, and there are significant resource and climate benefits in optimizing and transforming the existing building stock by converting empty, non-residential buildings into housing. Therefore, the government has taken measures to increase the financial incentives for municipalities to enable more conversions. Continued work on the transition to circular economy in the construction sector and further improvement of the energy efficiency in the building stock will be important, not least against the background of high production costs and energy prices. Finally, the government believes that the current climate declaration for new buildings should be extended. Furthermore, the government has completed consultation process on a proposal of limit values for new buildings' climate impact. The proposal is now being processed within the government offices. I hope you have a fruitful day of exchange knowledge and discussing common challenges for a sustainable and competitive Nordic construction sector. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Andreas, even though you're not on place here. So I think this is a good message for us today's meeting. So we will continue now with this EU Outlook and give an update about relevant EU policies on climate impact from buildings and construction products. So we will get a presentation from Philip Musley at the European Commission.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to come here. It's a pleasure to be here in Malmö. And I'm going to talk about whole life carbon and also focus especially on the new construction products regulation, which is we'll have the final text published very soon now in the autumn. And I work at the Directorate General for Internal Market and the Industry in the Commission. So whole life carbon, or the whole life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of buildings. This remains a high priority for the industry. Frequently it's expressed to us in the Commission through the High-Level Construction Forum, which is a forum that we regularly hold with industry and with member state authorities and researchers and others. So it has rapidly become a major part of EU construction policy, also through the transition pathway, which is a document that we published last year, setting out the twin green and digital transitions for the industry. And now it's firmly established not only in the construction products regulation, but also the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive and other parts of EU legislation as well, like the taxonomy. And very recently, our president, re-elected, has continued to put a focus on construction and, in this case, housing. So some of you may have noticed the new political guidelines for the Commission set out by our President in front of the European Parliament, where she announced that she will be appointing a Commissioner for Housing and also an European Affordable Housing Plan. I won't say anything more about that because we don't know yet exactly what's in it, but we can look forward to some more there. Now, focusing on the new regulation, which is a very important piece of legislation for construction, and especially for construction products, because it is the regulation that governs the placing on the market of construction products in the single market. It's meant to guarantee the free movement of products using the CE marking, and it's also creating this common technical language. It is what we need in whole life carbon. Also, it will be introducing a new digital product passport. So we will have, for the first time, this reliable data. And then, of course, through national building codes in the construction works, then that can be used. So the way the construction products regulation will work, this new system placing on the market, working in tandem with the national construction codes, and then we can have product requirements and product needs within the single market all governed together, and we will have these declarations of performance and conformity for every product placed on the market. So just a little overview of what is in the new construction products regulation and what it isn't. So the key parts of products are within the scope. Also, the parts or the materials that are intended to be used for products, things like parts, products that are delivered as part of a service, as part of the product, including those that are manufactured on the building site. 3D printing is in scope as well, and also packaging of products and instructions for use. And these are, of course, important for the circularity aspects as well. And then there are some parts that are excluded from products, such as lifts and the other parts that you can see here on the slide. Now, of course, for whole life carbon, we're really interested in the carbon footprint, and this is the first aspect of all of the life cycle analysis indicators that is going to be featuring in the CPR. The carbon footprint is one of many environmental indicators. We have a three-step approach in terms of timing for these to be coming into force. So climate change effects or global warming potential, or carbon footprint by any other name, is the first one. And then 4 years later, you have another group of environmental indicators that will become mandatory. And then 6 years after the date of application, the rest of them. So eventually we will have all of the indicators in life cycle analysis, all of that data available to designers. This is just to show that environmental product declarations, which is what we have at the moment, are of course voluntary, not harmonized, so you can have different data and different declarations from different manufacturers, and these are some of the things that we aim to improve in the new regulation. And so through this declaration of performance and conformity, the new CPR will establish some additional rules for manufacturers in relation to this. So there will be a section on the declared performance, which is something that we already have, but there will be a new section on the fulfillment of product requirements. So these could be environmental requirements for products. And then there will also be an improved section on product information. And on these product requirements, we have two systems really. We have the product requirements and we have the performance thresholds. And the two things are different. So this slide explains a little bit the difference between them. The product requirement is a kind of yes/no answer. Do you fulfill the requirement or do you not? Whereas the performance threshold is something that you can be ambitious or you can be more ambitious. And so the member states could set high ambition in the performance threshold. So to take an example of recycled content, it would be more effective to set this as a performance threshold, because if you say set a threshold of 25%, you could actually go higher than that and achieve 45%. Whereas with the product requirement, you would just meet it, yes or no, 25%, yes, you've met it, and you tick the box. And so the performance threshold is a really important thing when it comes to environmental ambition. But the product requirements, this kind of yes/no question, there are many possibilities. There are some under functionality, under safety, and under environment. So an example of a product requirement we could have under the environmental part would be recyclability. Is something recyclable or is it not? And something that would automatically rule it out, for example, could be the presence of hazardous substances that would rule it out from being recycled. And so these kinds of product requirements, these will be featuring in the new CPR, depending on the product family and the right way to apply it. So the product information, these construction products going on the market will be accompanied by general product information, instructions for their correct use, and safety information. But the annex of the regulation applies directly, and additional guidance about its implementation will be provided in the harmonized European standards. And then we could, if necessary, adopt delegated acts that could establish which information should be provided for certain types of products and how that should be provided. And so on the next slide, I'll just show you some information aspects that would be covered by this. So you'll not only have safety and compatibility and questions like that, but from an environmental point of view and perhaps whole life carbon, you'll have recommendations for the end-of-life treatment, and also the manufacturer could put maintenance needs in there. So, for example, you could have a window frame where the manufacturer can put with the product instructions on how to properly maintain it, how frequently to paint it, and with what substances. This kind of information could be really digitally associated with the product. Another aspect of the new construction products regulation is on environmental labels. So we could establish by a future delegated act a mandatory label. These would be, if we did establish these would be aimed at consumer-facing products, the kind of things that your ordinary DIY person would buy in a shop. And these would be quite for specific products. So, for example, insulation would be too broad a category because its labeling and performance would depend on how it's installed and where. But you could, for example, imagine something for insulation for flat roofs or something of that kind, a little bit more specific. So these would be consumer-focused labels which then give information on sustainability aspects to your ordinary consumer. So in a nutshell, what member states can do under the construction products regulation, they can establish minimum performances for all or certain applications of products. They can also establish or require more ambitious performance thresholds, and they could establish take-back obligations for unused products, which is a really good way of reducing waste. And things that can't be done would be establishing a different assessment method for the product declaration, demanding different third-party tasks to those defined in the regulation, requiring additional essential characteristics that are not included in the harmonized standard, and requesting fulfillment of additional or stricter product requirements. Now, all of this, a lot of this work is actually being done through the standards, and the standardization process is done through this system, the CPR Acquis, and all its expert subgroups for all the different product categories. They are busy at work updating these product standards. It's a huge piece of work to do this. There's, in the annex to the regulation, there's a priority list of all the different product families that you see here. But actually, if I wave my magic wand, this has been reordered now in agreement with the member states. So there's a reordering compared to what is in the annex in order to prioritize in the right way all the different products. So we're starting with precast concrete and then structural metallic products. Those discussions are already underway. And then one by one, we go through all of these product families, updating all of the standards. And so for those products, when they come on the market with the new standard, that's when all of these requirements of the new regulation applies to those. And then we also have a very important aspect for assessment and verification of environmental sustainability using notified bodies. In the new regulation, the notified bodies will have to be European and staffed by Europeans and located in the EU. And so this means that, for example, products made in a third country will still have to be assessed by European notified bodies. And this should ensure a level playing field with the rest of the world. That's enough on the regulation. I've just got two small slides on updates for you on the circular economy, which is of course relevant as well to whole life carbon. We've been carrying out a study on end of waste, and end of waste being the definition of when waste becomes a secondary material. There's a final report there, which you can see now, which recommends looking in more detail at the mineral waste streams for possible end of waste criteria. And then also the construction and demolition waste management protocol, which is a guidance document for waste management. This has been updated and revised, also with guidance on pre-demolition audits. It's available already in English. It's been sent for translation, and so eventually we will have it in all the EU languages as well. And thank you very much. I hope I've done justice to all your Nordic languages in my slide, and I wish you a really interesting event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have short of time of questions, but one question, if there's one. I think for bigger discussion we take in the afternoon, but if there's some question? Nobody? Yeah.
Is the timetable for CPR Acquis still 2045?
Yes, well, the speed of going through all of those product standard revisions is really just dependent on human resources, so we need to do it as fast as we can. We think at the moment it would take maybe about 10 to 15 years. We'll see in the next commission whether we can do anything to try and speed that up.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip, for presentation. And then I will welcome Lucy Ruck at Wigand & Magö, consultant on working on behalf of DG Energy. So please.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, my name is Lucy Ruck. I work at Wigand & Magö, like a consulting company working with the green transition. But I'm here today on the behalf of the European Commission, working with a support project for the life cycle global warming potential elements in the recast of the EPBD. And I will talk through Article 7.2, 7.3 and 7.5, and also our work related to that, where we make some technical guidance and support for the European Commission related to the implementation of these articles. I also want to highlight that few of the elements are not clarified finally, so also a lot of what I will say is like related to internal discussions and my interpretation based on the interpretation on the articles. But the final documents coming from the Delegated Act, and the roadmap will hopefully clarify it finally. But now I more present our considerations related to the support. Yes. Just a short background. Why are these elements implemented in the EPBD recast? And this is because buildings are responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions during, but also after and before the operational lifetime. So the EPBD focus now also beyond operational greenhouse gas emissions on the whole life cycle of emissions, starting with legislation on new buildings. And this should support, both the focus on the building design, the practices and the materials to reduce the emissions both on the operational and embodied carbons. Yes, and there are mainly 3 articles implemented in the EPBD recast. Article 7.2, specifying that there should be a calculation of the life cycle global warming potential for large new buildings from 2028, and for all new buildings from 2030. And further, there is the Article 7.3 highlighting which methodology to use, where there is some reference to a delegated act, which I will talk more about, and also the Annex 3, specifying the main principles of the calculation. And then we have Article 7.5, further implementing that the member states should publish and notify a national roadmap, also implementing limit values for all new buildings. Yes, putting this into a timeline, we can see that, the EPBD got formally adopted in April this year and published in May 2024. And from this, there's a transposition phase until implementing the articles within Article 7 until May 2026. End of 2025, the Commission is empowered to implement this delegated act, which I will talk further about, related to the specifying the methodology to calculate the life cycle global warming potential. In January 2027, the member states should publish the roadmap related to the limit values and the implementation of further limit values. From January 2028, all new buildings with a useful floor area over 1,000 square meter should have implemented a life cycle global warming potential calculation in the National Building Code. And then from January 2030, it should cover all new buildings, no matter the size, and there should also be implemented limit values for all new buildings. Yes. Okay, let's look further into the different articles. So starting with Article 7.2, it highlights that from 2028, there should be implemented this regulation for the life cycle global warming potential, and it should be disclosed in the energy performance certificate. And this was for the larger buildings, and for all new buildings, this has to be implemented by 2030 or be legally binding. There are no possible exemptions, and the Article 7.2 highlights that it should be for all new buildings. And there might be this confusion about the energy performance certificate, but as I read the article, it just refers to where the disclosure of the life cycle global warming potential calculation should be placed. And if no energy performance certificate is required for, as some new buildings are not required to make an energy performance certificate, it should be in some other building documentation, like for example in the building permit or when finalizing the building. Then we have the Article 7.3 highlighting how should the calculation and the disclosure of the life cycle global warming potential calculation be done, where there is highlighted where there's referred to Annex 3, highlighting the calculation methodology, but also further highlighted that the Commission is empowered to adopt a delegated act. And for this delegated act, I will talk further about which elements we consider to come with input for. But let's first look at Annex 3. Yes, so Annex 3 refers to EN 5978, which is the standard behind life cycle global warming potential calculations for buildings. And it also refers to the EU framework levels. And for the use of data, it refers to the construction product regulation as soon as this is in place. And until there, it will, through the EN 5978, refer to data based on EN 15804, which is the standard behind the EPDs. The calculation should be expressed as kilo CO2 equivalents per square meter, useful floor area, over 50 years, so in a cumulative manner. And about the scope of building elements, so which building elements to declare, there's referred to the levels framework, which in indicator 1.2 specifies which building elements to cover, which mainly is the whole building. Yes, further, there's also a reference to that national calculation tools and methods can be used if they exist. And the last point also says that methods and tools should live up to the levels framework. Yes, and as mentioned before, so Annex 3 is like pretty broad and basically covering a lot of elements to declare in your life cycle global warming potential for buildings. But there's this possibility that the delegated act specifies it further, which was written in Article 7.3. And we are currently coming with technical input on what this delegated act should cover. And here are some of our considerations. So as we read Article 7.2, we read it that the aim is that the whole life cycle global warming potential of buildings should be declared. That's the main goal, to cover all life cycle stages, for example, and the whole building. But we also know that a lot of member states are maybe not that ready, and especially outside of the Nordic countries. So we consider to have like a common denominator approach, which should support our harmonization more in the European countries to support the implementation of sustainable buildings further. So member states can learn from each other and also collaborate on some elements. So we consider to come with an input on that the scope of modules should be limited to maybe not cover the whole life cycle, by looking into the effort and effect, kind of, by looking into, okay, how much work does it require to declare the different modules versus what is the climate effect of savings. By also looking at the scope of the building models, because currently levels includes all building models, and we can see an advantage in maybe limiting it again on the building elements which make up the majority, for example, the load-bearing structures and the shell of the building. Yes, and then we also would like to look further into the scenarios, which there's also referred to, as the scenarios in EN 5978 are very broad for some modules. So it could also support some of the member states in saying, okay, what is relevant to look into in the declaration of the different modules. Yes, and then of course there's always the possibility for the member states to be more ambitious than this common denominator approach. And in general, the aim should be to work in the future with the whole life cycle of the building. Then we also want to look into, okay, how can we support member states in when to do the life cycle global warming potential declaration. I know in a lot of countries it's when the building is finished. There can also be the consideration to look into, okay, should there be some requirement to also do it when applying for building permit. And then we also want to clarify which area is useful to use for the declaration, because there should also be some balance within which building elements to include and which area to take, as this has big influence on the final result. But yeah, again, it's just our considerations right now, and we're also very interested in to hear your input, because these are like, yeah, we will work on a document to support the Commission in the final delegated act, yeah, which mainly right now covers these considerations. Let's jump over to the national roadmaps, which is Article 7.5, which specifies that from January 2027, the member states should publish and notify the Commission about a roadmap introducing limit values for all new buildings. And these limit values should also consider a progressive downward trend toward the Union's objective of reaching climate neutrality. So there should be like some downward trend of the limit values in the future. And there should also be consideration related to different climatic zones and building typologies in these limit values. And the last part of the article also says that the Commission should issue guidance, and this is what we currently support them with. Yes, we are working on a draft of the guidance right now, and we will also share it with member states in some European meetings to get input from their side. So the guidance will support them in the best possible way. Yes, and this are again our current considerations to the roadmap. You have to read this figure from the bottom up, but basically we approach it in a way to say, okay, the member states of course need a legal framework to be in place, which partly also comes from the delegated act and the whole EPBD framework. And then from experience from the Nordic countries, we know how important it is to have a methodology well established to build the limit values up upon that. Because if the methodology is different, the methodology in your national building code is different to what has been the base for the limit values, you have no idea about the ambition level, basically. So the methodology should be in place as the first thing and well established. And based on that, also data needs to be in place. Because the limit values will typically be based upon some cases where you need data to perform these life cycle global warming potential calculations. So this covers data for like construction products, which should be generic data, but also somehow have an aspect on EPDs, typically used in your member state. Then you need data for the operational energy use, for the reference service lives. So there's a lot to data to gather and to keep track on. Then step 2 will look into different cases. So you need to gather a lot of cases and further on analyze this data to set the limit values. Yes, just shortly. Also here, I really would like to get as much input as possible. Maybe not now, but like in the future, I will share in a second the link to our webpage. But this is just an idea of like further what will we cover about in the roadmap. Also looking into different roles and responsibilities for setting the limit values, but also how can member states look into this downward trend of setting the limit values. My last slide. Just a link to the webpage where everyone can register, and you will get updated on some stakeholder meeting, which we are planning to hold in October, where we further and more in detail will present our thoughts about the Delegated Act and the roadmap. So where everyone also has the possibility to give input, both on the meeting, but also beforehand or after. So if you have some good experiences or some good input, feel free to reach out. And member states will further also have the possibility to give inputs at, for example, the EPBD committee and the concerted actions. Yes, that was my slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for this presentation. And we have time for a question, if there's some. But you need to use the microphone. Any questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. You mentioned briefly the taxonomy, which also require the global warming potential calculation. And also, I would wonder if you could elaborate on the relationship between EPBD taxonomy and also the ESRS E1 that also requires global warming potential. Are there any collaborations there?
Yeah, okay. I don't think I mentioned taxonomy. I mentioned levels, right. But I think they are interlinked also. I'm not super familiar with the differences, but I think they pretty closely linked. But no, I don't think I can answer it precisely. But as I remember the article in the taxonomy, it's also referring to EN 15978 and levels. So I hope they somehow can be, yeah, Philip, maybe you can.
Yeah, Philip, please.
Yeah, maybe I can help to answer because I'm involved in working on the taxonomy as well. So there's a mechanism in the taxonomy to continually update the criteria. And so as we wait and see what happens with the EPBD in terms of this detail, we may update the taxonomy criteria in light of that. So we'll wait and see for the moment what comes out of this. But the taxonomy is meant to be a living thing.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucy and Philippe, for this presentation and this background. There's a lot coming from the EU level that we need to work with. So we will continue now with the Nordic outlook, and you will get a state of the art in the Nordic regulation, but also on highlights from the Nordic sustainable construction. It will be my colleague Thomas Johansson at Boverket and Helle Redde Momsen who will have this presentation. So please.
Thank you. Hi. Helle and me will now give you an outlook on the Nordic regulation and on climate impact from buildings and some results from the work from the Nordic sustainable construction. We're doing this presentation together, and I will start with a brief background. And my name is Thomas Johansson from Boverket. As Christina said, it all started for 6 years ago. Our first meeting in Malmö, matter of fact, in the Nordic Climate Forum. It was a great interest, and even some of you maybe participate there. It's nice to see the picture. We felt like pioneers, and we were pioneers. We only saw, and they invited to the Climate Forum. It's like today, it was from the academia and the construction sector industry. And we also early saw the need of Nordic collaboration in this complicated and difficult subject. We also saw the need of speaking and working with the academia and the construction industry. Since then, Estonia has joined the collaboration, and it's very nice. We also had a mission from the Nordic Ministers of Housing and Construction to collaborate on developing a regulation to reduce climate impact from buildings. And we still have. Because we in the Nordic region should take lead in Europe to reduce the climate impact from buildings. And now we have the result. We in the Nordic countries and Estonia are the front runners in Europe. But it wouldn't been possible without the help from the academia and the building sector, as shared our ambitions and provided us with knowledge and materials. As we heard, the EU has no set requirements on all member states on climate declaration and limit values. But we in the Nordic countries and Estonia already have or are planning soon to have a legalization in place on climate declaration, and for some of the countries, limit values. And that's several years before EU requirements are into force. The knowledge we built up will we share with other European countries, but also to EU in their work with guidance and delegated acts. But even if we had a fruitful cooperation, all countries have national traditions and policies as lead to differences in the legalization and the requirements. For instance, which building should be included, which building parts should be included, which stages and modules should be included. But this will Helle tell you more about, so please, Helle.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Yes, so my name is Helle Redder Momsen, and I come from the Danish Authority of Social Services and Housing, but also working very much with the Nordic Sustainable Construction. And as the minister said in his introduction video, and as Thomas have mentioned, then all the Nordic countries and Estonia are working closely together on how we can accelerate this knowledge. And we're really dependent on each other and the industry and the research background. So we have these 5 work packages that we work on to actually implement the declarations that the ministers have made on how to make the construction industry more circular and with lower environmental and climate impact. So we have these 5 work packages, but what the one I will dive into today is the first, and its results of that, because we've been working together since the end of 2021 on this specific program. And a lot of these results are actually coming out. There was one just this morning. So we'll try to share that with you, because a lot of that knowledge is really quite dependent on how do we then regulate. It sounds quite easy to just regulating it, but there's a lot of details. So we'll share some of that with you. So if you just dive into this work package 1, that's focusing on harmonization of how we do the LCA assessments. It's run by the Ministry of Environment in Finland. The work package leader is Maria right there. You can put the hand up. Yeah, at least those in the room can see her. If not, there's a lot of videos with her online, but it's all these topics that we're discussing, and a lot of the people, both online and here in the room, have contributed to actually accelerating the knowledge we then have generated in it. All the Nordic LCA authorities have been very much part of these and done a huge effort on commenting and giving the latest updates. This regulation is not a boring area, it's moving all the time, so to make these overviews is a thing. I will just show you the overview that the most reason that we have. I know there's a lot of details here, and we're lucky today that we have all the Nordic and Estonian LCA authorities, so they will give you the very first brief. But on this slide, you see that Sweden and Norway were the first to make this regulation that you have to calculate how much climate did your construction have of impact on certain areas and certain buildings. Then Denmark came in January 2023 with the same. You had to declare, but there was also a limit. So there's a budget to how much CO2 you could emit per square meter per year. And then you see all the other countries, it's coming. Some only have the declaration that you measure. I say only, that's wrong, but they measure that, and others also have the limit. And as Thomas was nicely saying, then we all get experience with this before it will be regulated and mandatory from the EU side. So of course all these experience and then all, maybe not the perfect pathways that we take, we want to share them in order to make sure that others maybe can leapfrog a bit. Yeah, and you see the EU in the very end, and some of the things that Lucy was also pointing to, that soon you'll have to do a roadmap how to reach there, and then in 2030 actually implement the limit values. Then, but like when you measure and when you put a limit, how do you do that? And here, just to put it out, and all the knowledge that have been gathered, we are different. As Thomas mentioned, there are different strategies and how to do it. And I just put a few like overall headlines, because when you do measure differently, of course, it can be quite difficult to compare. I will imagine today in the presentations, it can be a little bit difficult to compare the numbers just when you see them. But I'll give you like an overview now based on a lot of good work from people here, that hopefully will help you understand that there's a lot of details behind it and the reasons why they're different. So just one very basic thing, what buildings are actually included. So in the EBBD it says all new buildings, but what is that? And here you can see how the different countries, what do they see as the buildings that should be included. So that's the first part of the slide. And then the last part is also, so when you say all, do you really mean all? Do you mean like 20 square meters? Oh, what is the size and where do you start? So most countries have started with like larger buildings, and then later they move on to maybe down to 50 square meters, as I think is maybe in the Commission's proposal. I don't think it's crystal clear yet. So that is one thing where we can differ, the buildings that are actually included in the regulation. And then there's a lot of methodological choices in the regulation. Reference area is something I think everyone knows. It's a topic that it's difficult, but it of course also makes a difference. Do you just take the heated floor area or take a gross floor area? And then we have the which part of the limit value assessment, which scopes do you include? What is how many parts of that calculation do you include? Then there is the biogenic carbon. It can be included in the calculation in many ways, and that can also make quite a difference in the calculation and make it difficult to compare across countries. And then what parts of the building do you include? This also means a lot. Like, for instance, do you take fixed furnitures? Is that part of it when you calculate, or is it not? Yeah. And then there's more, but here I'll just I'll zoom into to the last one. So when you hand in your LCA calculation, like, is there a method to do that? Do you have a template or a database to do it, or can you do it in another way? This can be quite an important tool for regulators on how to follow up and actually measure it. And here some of the countries have some approaches that I think can be relevant to look into for others as well. Yeah, then more details on what is important, decarbonization scenarios. So we all know that we have ambitious goals for our energy mix and how much renewables will be included and how efficient we will use it. So of course, the decarbonization of the energy mix means a lot in your calculation and how much it will be. So what scenarios do you include? This is important. And then when you put generic data inside, you put this conservative factor in, but how do you make that? How much factors do you put on top of it? This is also an important area to at least to be aware that there can be big differences in the way you approach it. Standard values. As Lucy was saying, it can be very, when you start up, it's good to have standard, it could be good to have standard values, but of course it also is a motivation to actually improve if there are no standard values, but it's a balance of how much data do you have access to, and do the country have that database already. So if you zoom in just to limit values and some of the areas that is quite important for when you put limit values. And here you can see an overview of some of the areas, at least to consider. So the inventory scope, like I was mentioning, the fixed furnitures and refrigerants. Do you include it or not? It's a good consideration to take, at least if you're in the beginning of making the regulation and the methodology. Reference area, I mentioned it before. Depending on which one you use, it can be a benefit maybe to include other areas than not. Yeah, so this is an overview. I don't have a lot of time left, I'm told. So I hope that some of the overviews that we have shared also will spark some of the discussions for later today and give like an overview. What do we mean when we say that this is important to align? And also we're looking forward to the delegated act. So as I said, this is just a tiny sneak peek into some of the not regulation, but knowledge we have gathered to make as good as possible regulation. But you will find a lot of details also on other topics, how to have the skills to build better, or what are some of the characteristics for a sustainable construction product. You can find it all on the Nordic Sustainable Construction's website and Knowledge Center. And if you want to just look more into life cycle assessment, you'll actually see a lot of very interesting reports. So if you love the details, dig in there. And I think that was all from our side. Yeah, you can follow us. And thank you from our side.